Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Greed 2001. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is Jason Jet versus Kiwi. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Jet and Kiwi, with Jet keeping the pace of the match. Jet ultimately hits the finish on Kiwi, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Jason Jet. Hats off to Jason Jet for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Tag Team Championships. It is Elix Skipper teaming up with Kid Romeo versus Rey Mysterio and Billy Kidman. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Elix Skipper and Kid Romeo keeping the pace of the match. And Kid Romeo ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match, and at that time new WCW Cruiserweight Tag Team Champions, are Elix Skipper and Kid Romeo. Hats off to Elix Skipper and Kid Romeo for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Shawn Stasiak versus Bam Bam Bigelow. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Stasiak and Bigelow, with Bigelow keeping the pace of the match. But Stasiak ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Shawn Stasiak. Hats off to Shawn Stasiak for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lance Storm teaming up with Mike Awesome versus Conan and Hugh Morris. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Lance Storm and Mike Awesome keeping the pace of the match. And Mike Awesome ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Lance Storm and Mike Awesome. Hats off to Lance Storm and Mike Awesome for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Shane Helms versus Chavo Guerrero. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Shane Helms and Chavo Guerrero, with Shane Helms keeping the pace of the match. Shane Helms ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Shane Helms. Hats off to Shane Helms for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Lex Luger teaming up with Buff Bagwell versus the Natural Born Thrillers. I thought it was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Natural Born Thrillers keeping the pace of the match. And the Natural Born Thrillers ultimately hit the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are the Natural Born Thrillers. Hats off to the Natural Born Thrillers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ernest Miller versus Canyon. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Miller and Canyon, with Miller keeping the pace of the match. And Miller ultimately hits the finish on Canyon, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Ernest Miller. Hats off to Ernest Miller for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Rick Steiner versus Booker T. I thought it was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between both Rick Steiner and Booker T, with Rick Steiner keeping the pace of the match. But Booker T ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Booker T. Hats off to Booker T for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Dustin Rhodes versus Ric Flair versus, I believe, Jeff Jarrett. It was a good match, back and forth matchup, but Dustin Rhodes was keeping the pace of the match, with Rhodes hitting a roll-up, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Dustin Rhodes. Hats off to Dustin Rhodes for getting the win in this matchup. Yeah, it was a tag team matchup between Dustin and Dusty Rhodes versus Ric Flair and Jeff Jarrett, with Dustin ultimately hitting a roll-up and getting the win. So hats off to Dustin and Dusty Rhodes for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Greed 2001. It is a Falls Count Anywhere match. It is Diamond Dallas Page versus Scott Steiner. I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between DDP and Scott Steiner, with Scott Steiner keeping the pace of the match. And Steiner ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, hits the Steiner recliner. And he also becomes victorious in this match over Diamond Dallas Page. A couple things I'm going to say about WCW Greed 2001 before I get out of here, man. Number one, I did make a small mistake. It was Dusty Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes versus Ric Flair and Jeff Jarrett. Solid matchup. That was my mistake, number one. Number two, I want to talk a little bit about this pay-per-view. And what I mean by that is what it represents, what it means. It was the last pay-per-view for WCW. Now, for me personally, I was always a big fan of WCW, always have been, always will be. And I'm not saying I wasn't a fan of WWE, but I always remember watching WCW when I was growing up. So to see, that WCW's last pay-per-view was WCW's Greed. To be honest with you, man, it's kind of sad. It really is. I mean, when you look at, the body of work of what, guys like, Jim Crockett and Ted Turner and what they were doing, especially in the early days when NWA turned into WCW, it's crazy. It's crazy to see how it went from NWA and the amount of talent that NWA had when it was being run under Jim Crockett Promotions was incredible, man. I mean, you're talking about Ric Flair, you're talking about Dusty Rhodes, you're talking about Nikita Koloff, you're talking about Lex Luger, Dr. Death, Steve Williams, the Road Warriors, Rock and Roll Express. This is just to name a couple guys that were on that roster for NWA. Sting, and then we get into the Ted Turner phase of WCW. And it was, at the time, man, it was just incredible. What WCW did was absolutely insane. I mean, having Monday Night Nitro, the creation of the NWO, which is always and forever will be synonymous in professional wrestling, one of the all-time greatest stables of all time, and Hogan turning heel. It's just a lot of really cool moments that in the early days of WCW, they gave the fans. Sting turning into the Crow Sting. It just like awesome matches. I mean, Randy coming over from WWE over to WCW, the reunion of the Mega Powers, if you will, with Hogan and Randy. Like I said, Sting and his character transformation in WCW and what he went through, and just the amount of talent, man. Really, I mean, Ric Flair, Vader, all those guys came through WCW, man. It was absolutely insane. I mean, the matches were incredible, and to see it get bought out by WWE. And a lot, honestly, for what it's worth, a lot of the talent that was on WCW did not go over to WWE, man. That was it. You didn't see Lex. You saw Buff Bagwell for a little bit. A lot of those guys, man, Randy Savage, you didn't see him again. You didn't see Sting until, he showed up in TNA. And honestly, for what it's worth, a lot of the guys that were on WCW, they didn't go to WWE. They ended up going to TNA, TNA Wrestling. That was, I think, TNA, in a way, was like their last little hoorah of something they can do to kind of, go against WWE. It wasn't going to happen at the time with the amount of talent that WWE had at that time. I mean, 2001 and early 2000, I mean, WWE had incredible talent. Incredible. And they still do, and that's one of the reasons why you had to give credit where credit's due, man. WWE, they've been around from the very beginning, and they're still here, putting on great shows. They still have WrestleMania. It's just crazy, man. WCW in the past was absolutely incredible. The tag teams, the Steiners, Doom, Rock and Roll Express. I stated that tag team as well. The Skyscrapers. This is just a couple tag teams that wrestled for WCW, man. That were absolute powerhouses. Stone Cold Steve Austin also wrestled for WCW when he was stunning Steve Austin, and he was teaming up with Brian Pillman when they were the Hollywood Blondes. Fantastic tag team. There's just so much legacy and legend with the brand that it's just crazy that we don't get that today. Being a fantasy booker, and not to throw shade on, Vince or anything else like that, or WWE, but it would have been crazy, having a guy like Tony Khan having the opportunity to purchase WCW and see what he would have done with it. It would have been absolutely awesome. It's just crazy how that brand is no longer around. Everybody just has memories of that brand, and it's not just WCW. I mean, there's a lot of other brands out there that, all you have is memories, like ECW. I mean, ECW also changed the game in professional wrestling, man. I mean, they brought in a new dynamic of professional wrestling that no one else was doing, unless it was over in Japan with, like, FMW. Anita's company that he was running, with guys like Hayabusa and Onita. Mike Awesome was also a part of that brand as well. You're only getting that hardcore wrestling dynamic over in Japan. When Paul Heyman had created ECW or got involved with Eastern Championship Wrestling and then eventually made it into Extreme Championship Wrestling, what Paul Heyman did with ECW, it completely changed the game for professional wrestling. And he had so much talent on that roster, man. I mean, guys like Benoit, Guerrero, Sandman, Tommy Dreamer, Raven, Masato Tanaka. I mean, the roster that they had was absolutely incredible. The matches they had. I mean, ECW made RVD, made Raven. It made Tommy Dreamer. 100%. Those guys can't say anything else about that besides that company made those guys who they are today. You know, when you think about ECW, you think about those guys like Raven, Tommy Dreamer, Sandman, RVD, you know, and it goes hand in hand with WCW, man. There was some homegrown talent for WCW that, you know, just wasn't the same for him after WCW folded. You know, for example, Marcus Bagwell. I've stated this multiple times about Bagwell as well. Buff Bagwell, or Marcus Bagwell, he came in as a rookie, you know, but I still believe till this day, and I'm sorry, but there's nobody in this world that's going to change my mind. Bagwell's best body of work that he's put in as far as professional wrestling is concerned, in my opinion, is when he was teaming up with Too Cold Scorpio, and they were a tag team. They gelled perfectly in the ring together. They were being managed by Theodore Long. It was perfect. The tag team gelled absolutely perfect. You know, and I, honestly, for what it's worth, I can say the same thing about Ron Simmons and Butch Reed when they were part of Doom. I don't think it really benefited either one of those guys to split up and do their own, you know, singles run. Now, I'll give credit where credit's due. Ron Simmons, you know, he won the World Heavyweight Championship, and you know, that's great. It's fantastic. He's a great talent. But as far as what he can have done in his career longevity-wise, as far as championships, you know, are concerned, I think he would have had a better career staying with Butch Reed and Doom. I think Doom really was a strong tag team, severely underrated. They were both powerhouse guys. It could have been multi-time tag team champions, in my honest opinion. It was the same thing when the Steiners had ended up breaking up, and Scott Steiner did his own thing, and Rick Steiner. The only person that had benefited really was Scott. It didn't benefit Rick Steiner whatsoever. You know, and Scott Steiner, I mean, with all due respect to Rick, I mean, Scott's singles run was a hell of a lot better than Rick's. You know, absolutely. You know, it's just, like I said, man, long story short, it's just crazy to see that, you know, WCW went on this decline from late 1990, you know, the late 90s all the way up until 2001, until that Monday Night Nitro when Vince announced that he had bought the company. He bought his competition, and that was the end of WCW, man. It was the end of an era of, you know, so much talent that was on that roster, man. It all came to an end. You know, and it's just crazy to see that, like I said, we don't get anything. You know, the only thing I can say that we have with WCW that might be similar to today's wrestling is maybe AEW. And I'm not trying to put AEW in that spotlight of WCW, because a lot of people, you know, probably get upset about that comment. But what I'm saying to you is that AEW is that alternative. And that's exactly what WCW was to WWE even then, in 95. When 95 came around and Bischoff took control and he created Monday Night Nitro to go head-to-head with Monday Night Raw, it was competition. And not only was it competition, it was an alternative. You didn't have to just watch WWE. You can also watch WCW. Or some people, you know, had the opportunity to watch both at the same time. You know, Raw and Nitro. It was just a great time for the fans because you never knew what was going to happen. You didn't know who was going to show up on Raw. You didn't know who was going to show up on Nitro. You know, everybody, you know, the biggest myth was Rick Rude. Everybody talks about how Rick Rude went from being on Monday Night Raw one night, and then the same night he's on Monday Night Nitro. You know what I mean? It's just, it was a crazy time, man. When Lex debuted, the first Nitro, I believe, in Mall of America, the crowd erupted when Lex showed up. He got in the ring. He had a face-off with Hogan. Sting was in the ring as well. It was a great moment to see a guy like Lex Luger in WCW, especially the run he had with the Lex Express in WWE at the time, going up against a guy like Yokozuna. It was crazy. It was a crazy time in professional wrestling, man, and I don't think we're ever going to get that again, unfortunately. But with that being said, Greed's pay-per-view for 2001, it was a decent event at best. Again, man, like I said, it was just a steady decline for WCW, you know, at the end of the day. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW's Greed 2001 a solid rating of a 3.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Greed 2001. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.